When I first opened my eyes, I could not tell if the world was light or if I had simply forgotten what darkness was. There was a dim glow above me, neither flame nor sun, humming faintly like a trapped swarm of bees. The air was cool against my skin, too clean, too precise, and it carried none of the scents I knew. No smoke from the hearth, no damp oak, no human breath. Sterile stillness, touched by something metallic, sharp enough that I could taste it. I tried to lift my head, and the sound came first. A soft, rhythmic pulse somewhere to my left, mechanical and unwavering, not the beating of a heart, but its imitation. My body felt weighted, my limbs heavy as if filled with stone. I swallowed, the action foreign, and felt the dryness of a throat that had forgotten its purpose. I spoke before I knew the words. Where am I? The whisper scarcely reached my ears, and yet the sound startled me. It was my voice, but older, fragile like parchment that had lain too long beneath the damp. I waited for an answer. None came. Only the faint hum above me, steady and unnatural, and the pulse that reminded me of life but offered no comfort. I blinked again, and the world began to take shape. White walls, smooth and seamless, enclosing me in their indifferent glow. A window without glass but filled with light, not sunlight, I thought, too constant, too pure. I reached for it, the skin of my arm pale and thin, veins blue beneath the surface like rivers beneath ice. I had never seen my flesh so strange, so foreign. My memory stirred slowly, as though wading through thick fog. The last thing I remembered was rain. The smell of it on cobblestones outside the chapel, bells in the distance calling the faithful to vespers. My shoes had been soaked through, my breath misting in the chill of an April evening. I had looked up, watching the grey sky between the spires, thinking how it seemed ready to break open. And then, nothing. A shape flickered beside me. I turned sharply, though my body protested. It was a panel of glass, alive with colours and shapes that moved without hands. A voice emerged from it, soft, feminine, not unlike a prayer murmured behind a confessional door. "James," it said, "you're safe." I froze. How could she know my name? The voice had no source I could see, no figure, no lips forming the sound. My heart, sluggish as it was, stirred beneath my ribs. I tried to speak again, but the air betrayed me. Who speaks? There was silence. Then the voice again, smooth and composed. "You've been asleep a long time." Asleep. The word drifted through me like smoke through rafters. I wanted to laugh, but the sound would not come. Sleep did not last this long. Sleep did not steal centuries. And yet, centuries. The thought arrived unbidden, impossible, but there it was. I closed my eyes. For a moment I imagined I was still in London, the year of our Lord 1540-something. I could see the narrow streets by candlelight, the black river whispering secrets to the night. I could smell the tallow and the mud, the sharp scent of wet leather and roasting chestnuts. I heard the creak of wagon wheels over stone, the distant song of a drunkard stumbling home from the tavern. I remembered her too, Margaret, her hair catching the last of the daylight through the chapel window, golden and soft as the wheat fields of Kent. She had smiled when she saw me, her hand resting over mine as we whispered vows not meant for priests. I had thought the world eternal then, that kings and plagues and wars might come and go, but love would remain. How foolishly certain I was of time. The hum of the room grew louder, pulling me back to the present. The glass panel brightened and words appeared upon it, letters forming themselves without quill or ink. "Welcome back, James." Back. The word unsettled me. Back from where? I tried to sit, but the motion sent a tremor through me, and the sheets that covered me whispered like paper. My legs were bare beneath them. The texture of the cloth was unlike linen, smoother, colder, without scent or stain. I had once slept on straw-stuffed mattresses beneath coarse wool blankets, the air thick with dust and the warmth of human breath. This bed was too perfect, too empty. I turned my head again, and in the corner of the room stood a mirror. For a long moment, I did not recognize the man within it. His hair, once dark, had turned a pale silver. His eyes were the same, grey-green, uncertain, but rimmed with shadows of sleeplessness that no rest could cure. His face was lined with time he had not lived. I whispered to the reflection as though to a ghost. "How long?" The voice from the glass answered gently. 503 years. I felt the world tilt, not with fear, but with wonder so vast it silenced me. 5 centuries, the England I knew was gone. The church bells, the markets, the cries of the fishwives on the Thames, all dissolved into dust. The kings who ruled, the poets I once envied, the lovers buried in unmarked graves, gone. I looked to my hands again, to the faint tremor in them, and felt an ache that was not pain, but remembrance. The voice spoke once more. "You are safe, James. You are among friends." Friends. I closed my eyes and listened. The hum of the machines was constant now, like the low chant of monks in the choir stalls, soothing and unending. The air felt alive with quiet purpose, the way a chapel feels when no one is inside it, but something sacred remains. I breathed deeply, my lungs filled with air that did not smell of smoke or sea or city, only purity, a kind of nothingness so complete it became its own presence. I could taste my past in its absence. "Tell me," I whispered, though I did not know to whom, "what world have I awakened to?" No one answered. Only the hum replied, soft and eternal. I let my thoughts drift, as if carried by that sound. I thought of the first time I saw London, a boy of 12 clutching my father's hand, the city alive with shouts and colour and danger. I had never seen so many faces, so many hopes pressed together in one breathless place. The smell of bread from the bakeries, the iron tang of the blacksmith's forge, the river carrying all manner of things, both holy and profane. The people had been rough and loud and endlessly alive. Now there was silence. No laughter, no footsteps above, no wind against the shutters. Only me, a relic breathing among ghosts of machines. The thought did not frighten me. Instead, I felt a strange peace settle upon me, like snow falling on an old roof. Perhaps this was not punishment, but grace, to awaken after the world's fury had passed and find it reborn in quiet. I leaned back, closing my eyes again, and let memory and present mingle. The hum became the sea, and I was once more upon the cliffs of Dover, the gulls circling overhead, the wind tearing through my hair. Margaret stood beside me, her laughter lost to the wind. The world stretched before us, vast, unknowable, and young. Now the world is new again. But I am no longer young. I open my eyes once more, to the soft, unending light of this strange age, and whisper to it, as one might whisper to God in the dark. I remember. And the machines, in their steady chorus, seemed to listen. The voice that had comforted me faded into the room's gentle hum, and with it came a soft rustle of fabric and the almost soundless kiss of rubber soles upon the floor. A woman stepped into my sight, as though she had always been there, a calm presence shaped by pale light and the quiet assurance of one acquainted with thresholds. Her face was open and kind, framed by dark hair coiled neatly, and her eyes held the steady warmth of someone who spends long hours listening for the slightest change in a breath. She touched the rail of my bed, the metal cool under her fingers, and the faint scent of soap and something floral followed the movement of her sleeve. "James," she said, and my name felt safe in her mouth. "I'm the nurse on this ward. My name is Asha." The name was music to me, bright as a bell struck at dawn. "I'm going to tell you something plainly, and I'll stay with you while it settles." I swallowed, and the sound seemed to echo inside me. The hum of the light deepened. Somewhere in the corridor a trolley moved, wheels whispering, a soft rattling like distant cutlery. "It is the year 2025, she said. The words did not strike me like thunder. They fell like snow, each flake landing and melting, until I could feel the cold of the drift beneath my ribs. I thought I should gasp, or cry out, or fling off the sheets and run, but none of that came. Instead, the room expanded around the sentence. 2025. The numbers rang, slow and measured, as though counted upon a rosary of air. My fingers curled slightly against the smooth fabric as if it might ruck and gather into the weave I remembered, heavy and human, but the sheet only sighed and lay flat again. Asha watched my face the way a gardener watches the sky, reading it for weather. "You're safe," she said again, and I believed her. She guided a sip of water to my lips. The straw was a curious reed, pliant but certain, and the water itself tasted of nothing at all, which was to say, it tasted like mercy. "Tell me again," I murmured. "Say the year slowly." She smiled, and the lines at the corners of her eyes told me she smiled often. 2025. I repeated it in my mind as one might repeat a prayer, whose meaning will arrive only with the 10th or the 100th recitation. Then the shock rose at last, gentle but tall, a tide that lifted my chest and set it down again with a tremor. Tears came without sting, as quiet as the rest of this strange world, and I was surprised to find they were warm. Asha remained still while they passed, the manner of one who knows that comfort sometimes is simply a witness to what has been lost. When the steadiness returned, she adjusted a thin line at my arm, a delicate tether disappearing into a clear bag that hung like an obedient glass moon. The bag swayed slightly, and the tube drew a pale line to me, as though the future had threaded its way into my blood. "Do you wish the window blind raised a little?" she asked. "Yes," I said, because the word felt like a door, and I was learning to open doors again. She pressed something upon the wall, and a hush of fabric lifted. Light spilled into the room, not the gold of candle, not the fickle brightness of a winter sun, but a broad, even clarity that pressed no shadow hard against any edge. Beyond the glass, the world arranged itself in layers, a pale sky rinsed of soot, buildings that shone as if planed by a carpenter's hand, and then plated with river water, the suggestion of a road keeping a patient, unceasing rhythm under vehicles that moved like careful beetles. A smear of red passed, vivid, confident, and I recognized nothing, yet understood it was a bus only because the word tugged at a thread and wound itself into place. Sound drifted in when the window became a thing to look through and not a wall, a siren whose distant waver, courteous and practiced, the murmur of voices in a language that was mine and not mine syllables, delivered on an airy current of speed, the soft cough of machinery at rest and at work. The air from the vent brushed my cheek with a tempered coolness, like a hand trained not to startle. I felt inside my chest an answering movement, a desire to stand, to test the weight of this body in this age. Asha sensed it. "We can try sitting if you like," she said, and her palms came to my forearms with a respectful pressure, not unlike a priest's when he steadies a penitent rising from his knees. The bed obeyed a hidden order and lifted me the way a tide lifts a boat left on shore. My spine uncurled, vertebra by vertebra, each one rediscovering its own small vocation. My feet found the floor at last. It met me not with stone's indifference nor with rush's forgiving rustle, but with a crafted resilience, a muted spring that seemed designed to remember footsteps and forgive them at once. I felt the world tilt and then right itself, as a mast catches wind and settles. The tube in my arm swayed. The monitor's green line on the glass panel wrote me again in light, a stanza of heartbeats. Asha let me stand long enough to know I could, then guided me back, and I thanked her with a nod that came from a depth I had missed. My breath had that clean edge again, the bright nothingness of it. I closed my eyes and let the room sit upon my skin as a cloak might in Advent, a sign that something is coming even when no one can say from which road. From the bed, the things around me began to acquire names of their own free will. The clear bottle, saline. The push button by my hand, call. The blue emblem on a poster on the far wall, NHS. The letters themselves were excellent and crisp, not the uneven charm of handwork type, but the unblinking certainty of an age that believes in repetition without loss. National Health Service. I rolled the words upon my tongue and found a kind of liturgy in them. National Health Service, a country that promised care as a covenant. Memory came to sit beside me as though it had been banished from the room and had found its way back through a side door. I smelled again the lanes of London in spring rain, wet felt hats and damp wool cloaks, the round animal warmth of a fishmonger's barrel, smoke that clung and insisted. I saw the chandlers scraping tallow, their knives flashing dull, and the glaziers fitting leaded panes that gathered the day's light into tiny, trembling lozenges. I heard the new, bold English in the churches where Latin had lately ruled. Words had changed their clothes and come down among the people. Saints' faces were lifted from their niches and carried out under sacking. The walls wore the chalky blankness of someone pretending not to grieve. And in the market a boy cried oysters, and a poet I did not know stood upon a step and tested a line aloud, and a woman in a green kirtle haggled over apples, as if the sweetness of Eden could be lowered by half a penny. In that time I had been no one of consequence, and yet the world had made room for me at every turning. I worked with ink and figures and tidings. My fingers carried the faint ghosts of letters wherever I went. Margaret smiled at those stains, and teased me that I kept a little of every message for myself. Under the hush of a chapel, we spoke of a future that we described as if we were painting upon plaster that had not yet dried. Above us, a saint's face looked down, its colours grown pale but still tender, and I thought then, as every young man thinks, that the paint would never crack. In this new room, a box upon a wheeled stand stirred into life, and faces appeared there like lantern slides, but with a quickness that made my breath pause. A man with grey hair and a measured voice spoke of matters that moved across the bottom of the picture in a crawl, letters slipping by faster than I could gather them. I caught fragments: the economy, the weather's displeasure, a meeting of leaders in some other brightness, and then a photograph, solemn and polished, of a man in a dark suit with a guarded smile. His name followed, spoken as though it were known in every kitchen. The presenter said, "His Majesty the King," and something inside me startled, like a bird flown from a hedgerow into sudden light. Asha saw me attend to it. "We can turn it down if you prefer," she offered. "No," I said softly, "not yet." His name reached me a moment later, as if it had been walking behind the picture and came round to greet me in person. Charles. They called him Charles, and they numbered him the third. It stirred something like an echo of names I had never known in life, but had encountered in the shapes of others, telling. A Charles whose head had met steel, a Charles who had made a restoration of what had been torn. I knew then that my century had birthed long rivers of consequence that I must one day learn to name. But for now the knowledge was only a ripple across my skin. Asha dimmed the sound so that it became a companionable murmur, like voices in a refectory at supper. "It's a lot," she said. "People have many feelings about the monarchy. Families, isn't it? Everyone has a view." The word families warmed me. It made the monarchy seem less like a crown in a crisis and more like a householder's long conversation across seasons. "Do they love him?" I asked, surprised by my own appetite for the question. She considered. "Some do in a quiet way. Some feel protective, especially after... well..." She paused, letting the after stand gently without naming it. "Others question what it all means in our time. It's complicated, but most things are." The calm fairness of her answer told me more than any proclamation could. I pictured kitchens bright with evening news cups of tea cooling while opinions rose and settled, streets where banners might flutter in celebration and others where they would not. A long reign behind this age that had become a kind of weather everyone had learned to dress for. I thought of kings as I had known them, distant, divine in the mouths of priests, fear shaping the air around their names, and then of this king, whose name moved through the room like an ordinary wind, stirring curtains but not tearing roofs. A porter passed the doorway, pushing a cart stacked with linen folded into gentle geometry. He glanced in and offered a nod that embraced me without intruding. A young doctor followed with a tablet held like a book, the glow on his face a soft second light. There was a cleaner with a neat plait and a badge bearing a sunflower that made me think of late August in fields beyond Kent. A chaplain stood at a distance for a while, his collar a small accent of purpose, and then moved on when he saw my nurse had built a harbour in the space. They gathered without quite meaning to, drawn perhaps by curiosity or by the quiet gravity of a room in which the past had chosen to breathe again. Asha did not shoo them. She gave them the look of someone curating a small miracle. The doctor perched on the visitor's chair, elbows on knees, posture attentive but easy. The porter leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands tucked, eyes with the kindness of a man who has seen many arrivals and departures and knows that both are forms of courage. The cleaner rested her hand upon the handle of her cart as upon a railing of a bridge, content to look over a river without crossing it. On the screen, the news had moved on to weather maps that looked like artworks made with dyes on silk. I sat a little higher, feeling the room settle into a circle shaped by breath. My voice was there when I reached for it, a little steadier now, though its age surprised me anew. I glanced at the window again, at the pale architecture of this century, at the sky that belonged to no era and every era, and I thought of the cobbles damp with April, of the bells that called the city to prayer and to gossip and to trade, of Margaret's hand warming the ink-stained cold of mine. "I can tell you," I said softly, "something of the time I came from," and their faces opened a fraction more, as flowers do to a cautious sun, "and of what little I have gleaned of your king, and how the people hold him in their talk and in their silences. I will begin with the streets, if you'll allow, because a city is a sovereign of its own kind, and London—" I paused, tasting the name as if it were a sacrament returned to my tongue after a long penance. London was a book written underfoot, each stone a syllable. In my day the reign was Henry's, and the walls of the churches were still speaking, though some had been made to whisper, and when I hear you say Charles, the third of that name, I think of how names cross centuries like bridges, and I wonder who among you wakes with affection and who with a question. But first, let me give you the smell of tallow on a cold morning, and the way a baker's door spills heat into a lane, and the way we listened when the King S will ran like a new river through old fields, and then perhaps you will tell me in turn how a crown sits in a gentler age, whether it is worn like duty or like comfort, whether it presses or protects, whether his name floats in your kitchens like steam or hangs like a portrait in a hallway, passed without thought. And as I set down one century and pick up another, I will try to carry both without dropping either. For Margaret once said a man can be two things if he is careful, and I remember the last year before I drifted away, I said, letting the words rise gently as if pulling them through water. It was the year 1543, I believe. Spring came early, and with it came unease. We spoke then of the king more than of God, and that in itself was a change none of us quite knew how to name. Henry was our sun and our storm both. When he smiled, men flourished. When he frowned, they vanished. News in those days travelled like smoke. You caught a whiff of it first, uncertain of its source, and by the time it reached you, it had changed shape 3 or 4 times. The royal court would issue proclamations on parchment, pinned to doors or read aloud in the squares by the king's officers, their voices thick with the authority of those who feared the man they served. The church was slower to speak, yet its pulpit carried its own weight, priests whispering what could be said and more often what could not. And for the rest of us, it was the town criers and the markets, the gossip of merchants who travelled between towns, or the murmur of alehouse corners. A man might hear of a beheading and by nightfall learn 3 different reasons for it, each more convincing than the last. Henry had begun to look heavier then. They said he could scarcely mount a horse without help, though none dared speak it too loudly. Yet his temper had lost none of its edge. He was a man with a hunger for control, and for affection too, though the two rarely kept each other's company. His wives, poor souls, were the measure of his restlessness. By the time I last walked the streets of London, there had already been 3 queens buried or banished, and we spoke cautiously of a 4th. I remember one story, told to me by a clerk from the Court of Chancery. He'd seen it with his own eyes, or so he swore, how the king, in one of his black moods, had ridden out from Whitehall along the Thames, his retinue trailing behind, and when the wind turned, he ordered the barge stopped in midstream. He stood there, they said, pointing towards the tower with that broad hand of his and muttering of betrayal. None dared ask whose. Some whispered it was the Queen's, others said it was the Pope's shadow that troubled him still. The clerk told me that the river itself seemed to draw back, as if it too feared his gaze. That was the England I left behind, full of rumour and splendour and unease. The church had split like a cracked bell. The monasteries stood empty or in ruins, their stones sold off to noblemen with more coin than conscience. The old faith was forbidden in word, yet not in heart. My mother still crossed herself when no one watched. My father kept a small book of Latin prayers hidden beneath the floorboards. We spoke of loyalty to the king, yes, but in our prayers we asked that his temper be softened and his heart turned from blood. I look at your world now, I continued softly, glancing at the faintly glowing panels and the quiet machines. And I imagine you no longer wait for men in fine coats to shout proclamations in the square. You must have some new way, messages that travel faster than the wind, perhaps. Voices that cross oceans in the time it takes to draw breath. The king I served could scarcely trust a man to deliver a letter without opening it. Yet now I think words must move like light itself. It's a thought both wondrous and strange. The nurse and her small gathering listened with stillness, their faces a blend of curiosity and the kind of pity one keeps politely hidden. I smiled faintly, realizing how the air of confession had settled over us. We never truly knew our monarch, I said. He lived in palaces guarded by protocol and fear. We glimpsed him only when he wanted to be seen, grand processions through London, the clatter of hooves on stone, banners snapping in the wind, his face broad and red above a collar trimmed with ermine. Yet even then there was something behind his eyes that the people recognized. Power, yes, but also loneliness. Perhaps the two are the same thing, only worn differently. I leaned back against the pillows, the hum of the machines filling the pause between words. I imagine you know far more of your king than we ever could of ours. You might see him upon that moving glass, hear his voice as if he stood beside you. In my time the king's words reached us by decree, by rumor, by priest and crier. The truth was never the same shape twice. We lived in the echo of power, not its sound. I looked to the window once more, where clouds passed like soft thoughts across the pale afternoon sky. So much has changed, and yet I smiled faintly to myself. I think people still wait for the same thing. A voice to believe in, a face to remind them they belong to something larger than themselves. We did not call it democracy then. We called it hope. My eyes drifted for a moment to the far edge of memory where Margaret stood once more in the chapel light, and then back to the present, where the nurse and her listeners leaned closer, their silence like candlelight. Yes, I murmured, almost to myself. It was 1543, and the king was still married, for the moment at least. There was talk, always talk, that he might take another if this one displeased him. And somewhere, in that noise, I suppose I fell asleep. And when I opened my eyes, I found that 5 centuries had passed, and the world had learned to whisper instead of shout. The nurse's pen hovered over her notes, and the others watched me as though listening for some secret yet to be spoken. I let the stillness lengthen before I spoke again, my voice dropping to a softer thread of sound. In those days, I said, the court told us that obedience was peace, but I think, even then, the people knew better. They whispered their prayers and shared their stories, and kept a small piece of truth for themselves. Perhaps that too has not changed. I drew a breath, tasting the air of this new age, clean and quiet. You said the year was 2025, I murmured, almost smiling. Then surely your voices must reach further than any king's crier ever dreamed. The nurse met my gaze, her expression gentle but unreadable, and I thought to ask her how news spreads now, how truth survives its journey. But the words lingered unspoken, still forming on my tongue, as the hum of the machines filled the space between centuries. I remember, I began softly, a morning so bright it seemed the whole of London had been polished for show. The air shimmered with anticipation, the kind that clings to the skin and makes even the most weary labourer stand a little taller. I was among the crowd along the river when the royal barge came gliding up towards Whitehall. Its oars cut the water like strokes of mirrored glass, and the banners, red and gold, trembled in the wind. And upon it, standing proud and impossibly calm, was her, Anne Boleyn. I had heard her name long before I ever saw her face, whispered with equal parts awe and suspicion. Some said she bewitched the king, that he could think of nothing else once she smiled upon him. Others said she was clever beyond measure, too clever for a man so used to obedience. But when I saw her that day, I believed all the stories and none of them. She was not of ordinary beauty. Hers was the kind that drew the world's gaze and made it forget its business. Her gown caught the sun like rippling water, her dark hair tucked beneath a headdress that sparkled faintly as she moved. She raised a gloved hand, not in pride, I thought, but in recognition of the crowd, as if she knew we were witnesses to something greater than ourselves, something history would never quite stop talking about. I remember thinking then that she looked both triumphant and terribly alone. A woman rising higher than her station, but surrounded by men who built her throne with one hand and sharpened the axe with the other. None of us said that aloud, of course. We cheered, as was expected. But there was something in the silence after the cheering, that heavy stillness that follows too much joy, that told us some beauty burns too bright to last. She was the most striking woman I had ever seen, and now, 500 years later, I can only imagine how much more you must know of her, her words, her letters, her fall. Perhaps you know truths I never dared to wonder. You live, I think, in an age where nothing is easily lost, where a person's likeness might be kept somehow, perhaps in paintings preserved better than our own, though even paint fades. I hope her image has been preserved, that her face still exists somewhere, as she was that morning, with the light upon her and the wind in her veil. For my memory, though dear to me, grows softer with each breath, and I fear it will dissolve like ink left too long to the rain. I paused, gazing towards the window, the pale light now tinged with the soft gold of afternoon. Beyond the glass, something moved against the sky, a silver sliver too distant to make sense of. At first I thought it a trick of the eye, a reflection upon the window pane. But no, it grew larger, steady and sure, cutting through the air without wings that beat. I leaned forward slightly, my heart giving a small, startled leap. "Good Lord," I whispered. "Is that a floating carriage?" It glinted, vast yet graceful, gliding across the heavens like a fish through still water. My pulse quickened, half in fear, half in delight. "It moves without horses," I murmured, "and yet it does not fall. There must be ropes or perhaps some invisible wind harnessed by your age. Do your nobles travel thus? Is that how your king moves between his palaces now?" I glanced at the nurse who, I think, offered some gentle word in explanation, though her meaning slipped through the net of my understanding. "Aeroplane," I repeated uncertainly, testing the word as though it were Latin I'd once half learned. "Aero-plane. How curious. It sounds like something Aristotle might have dreamt, an argument about air given the shape of reason." I sat back, chuckling quietly to myself. "Well," I said, still watching it vanish beyond the horizon, "if I'd seen such a thing in my own time, I'd have declared it witchcraft and prayed for forgiveness before supper. I'm not entirely sure I shan't still." The room's hum settled again around me, the machines whispering their patient rhythm. I smiled faintly at the window, the afterimage of the flying marvel still hovering in my mind. "Your world," I said softly, "has learned to climb the sky, and here am I still trying to stand." The nurse must have noticed something in my expression, perhaps the trace of longing that lingers when one speaks too fondly of the dead. I saw her hesitate, then step softly closer, the light from the window brushing across her sleeve as she drew something from the pocket of her gown. It was a small flat object, black and smooth, no larger than a book of psalms. She held it delicately, as if aware it carried a kind of power, and with a touch of her finger the thing awoke. Light bloomed from within it, pure and sudden, a brightness without flame. I flinched instinctively, half raising a hand as though to shield myself, yet she smiled gently, not mockingly, and turned the object so I might see. Upon its surface was a face. I leaned forward, unsure whether to trust my sight. It was a woman's face, pale, dark-eyed, serene, and though every line was sharper and clearer than any painted miniature I had ever seen, something in me rebelled against the perfection of it. "This," she said quietly, or perhaps I only imagined the words, "is Anne Boleyn." My breath caught. "No," I said too quickly. "No, that cannot be her." The image changed. Another woman, another angle, each one bearing her name. Some showed her smiling faintly, some solemn, some crowned, some undone by sorrow. I shook my head, my pulse unsteady. That is not the lady I saw upon the river. Her eyes were brighter, her mouth gentler. The turn of her chin— No, it is all wrong, you've been misled. The nurse's finger slid across the surface again, and the glass obediently conjured more faces, more versions of the same woman. It was as if 1,000 painters had all agreed on her likeness, and yet I could not see her in any of them. Each picture was too real and not real at all, a stillness so exact that it felt unnatural. "What magic is this?" I whispered. "How do faces come to dwell in glass?" The nurse did not speak, only tilted the strange device slightly so that its glow softened. I could see my own reflection in it now, faintly ghosting over Anne's. 2 centuries tangled in a single pane. I drew back sharply, the weight of wonder tipping toward fear. I see myself in it. Is it a mirror? No, but it moves. The light shifts when I do. By heaven, how is this done? Some trick of lenses, perhaps, or witchcraft. The word escaped before I could stop it, half jest, half dread. "In my time, they burned women for less than this," I murmured. To summon a face from the ether, to keep it alive within a piece of glass. I reached out tentatively, my finger brushing the surface. It was warm, alive somehow, and smooth as polished stone. The image trembled at my touch, shifting to another likeness. A man's face this time, strange and stern. I recoiled slightly, a startled laugh breaking from my throat. "It listens. It changes when commanded. You need no ink, no parchment, no painter's hand, only touch." I looked up at the nurse, my breath shallow. "In my day, to preserve a likeness took hours, days, a painter's devotion, a sitter's patience. Even then what remained was only an echo, a suggestion. But this—" I gestured to the device, its light pooling across her palm. "This is life captured and imprisoned. It cannot be natural." She said something, words I only half understood, about photographs and records, and how images could be kept by the millions. Millions. I pressed a trembling hand to my temple and tried to picture it, a world where faces never faded, where a smile could outlive its owner. The thought filled me with awe and a quiet grief. "Then nothing is ever lost," I said softly. "Not even a face." The nurse smiled again, kindly, but I could not look at the device any longer. "Put it away," I whispered. "Please. She was not that woman. I will not have her trapped in that thing." She nodded once and slipped it back into her pocket, the light dying quietly within. The air between us settled, though my heart still raced. I turned my eyes to the window once more, needing the comfort of something real, the steady motion of clouds, the sound of distant wind. "That glass of yours," I murmured after a long silence, "shows miracles no scripture ever promised. In my time, only God could preserve the dead. Now it seems you can do it with a touch." I smiled faintly, though the smile trembled at its edges. "I suppose your age calls that progress, but to me it still smells faintly of sorcery." The nurse said nothing. Only the machines answered, whispering their even song. And somewhere beyond the window, a world of light and memory carried on, capturing faces I could no longer trust to time. The nurse must have sensed my unease beginning to settle, for she stepped forward once more, that peculiar device cradled carefully in her hands. Its surface gleamed like black water before dawn, holding its silence with a strange dignity. I almost told her not to show me more, but curiosity, that oldest and most troublesome of sins, still lived in me. She touched it again, and light returned as if breathed into being. Another face took form within the glass, broad, red-cheeked, the eyes sharp and weary all at once, the beard thick and trimmed with pride. I froze. My breath caught mid-draw, the sound of the machines in the room fading until only the memory of a heartbeat filled the space. "God help us," I whispered. "That is him. Henry, King Henry, by the grace of God, defender of the faith, Lord of England and Ireland, and the terror of any man who stood too close to his will." The likeness was so exact that it made my bones ache. Even the eyes, those pale, watchful eyes, seemed to look straight through me, as if time itself meant nothing to his gaze. "Yes," I breathed. "That is how I remember him." The jaw, the shoulders, the very shape of command. He looks ready to speak, doesn't he? As though he might issue a decree and expect the heavens to obey it before the ink dries. My hand trembled as I pointed. You see that ring upon his finger? I have seen it with my own eyes. I was a boy then, no more than 17, when I stood among the crowd as he passed through Westminster after the fall of Thomas Cromwell. The air that day was thick, not with rain, but with the quiet that follows a storm. Men dared not speak Cromwell's name above a whisper. He had been everything, the king's instrument, his shadow, his mind made flesh. And then, in one summer week, he was gone. We heard he died by the axe, though none dared ask how swiftly it fell. I swallowed hard, staring at the glass as though I might step through it. It was said Cromwell grew too bold, that he thought himself secure enough to command the king's desires, but no one commands Henry. Not wife, not minister, not priest, nor pope. When he smiled upon you, it was like standing in sunlight. But if he turned, if that smile faded, I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The nurse's device shifted slightly in her hand, and the picture's light glowed brighter. Henry's eyes seemed almost alive. He hasn't changed, I murmured. Half a millennium, and still his image rules the room. I drew back a little, uneasy under that unflinching stare. I see now why his likeness has endured, I said, voice low. He would have demanded it. Every painter, every craftsman who captured his form, they must have known their task was not to flatter, but to preserve him exactly as he saw himself, the immovable, unanswerable king. He was powerful enough to bend the church itself. Of course he would bend time, too. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He frightened us, you know, even those who adored him. When he passed, people bowed because their knees gave way from fear, not reverence. Yet we loved him still, in the way that a child loves thunder, in awe of its might, grateful when it passes. My gaze softened, though my pulse still stirred beneath the memory. In those last years before I slept, his wife was Catherine Parr. A gentle soul by all accounts, learned and calm, though I remember hearing whispers that even she had nearly fallen to his suspicion. He tired of affection as quickly as he took to it. None could keep his favour for long, not Anne, not Jane, not even Cromwell, who once stood higher than any priest in the land. The nurse's device dimmed as she lowered it, the king's face dissolving into black glass once more. I found myself exhaling deeply, as though a great weight had at last been lifted from the room. I cannot explain it, I said quietly, rubbing the bridge of my nose. That face, it commands me still. Even through your sorcery of light and glass, it's as if the years between us were nothing. He looks ready to summon Parliament, to unmake a man with a word. Perhaps that's his true immortality, not the flesh or the crown, but that gaze. You've kept him alive, better than any tomb. The nurse's lips moved, perhaps some gentle reassurance, but I barely heard her. My thoughts had already turned inward, to candlelit corridors and the murmured prayers of men who feared the next dawn. I once thought I'd live to see England softened after his reign, I murmured, that the world might grow kinder when such tempests passed. But I woke instead to find the king's eyes waiting for me, bright as ever, untamed by death. Tell me, in your age, does he still rule the history you teach? Do you still walk in his shadow? For I think I still do. I let my voice drift, the hum of the machines folding around it like quiet surf. Strange, isn't it? I whispered, glancing once more at the darkened glass in the nurse's hand. How power lingers longer than flesh, and fear forgets no century. The light in the room had softened to a dusky gold, that quiet hour when day yields to evening, and the air itself seems to rest. The nurse had moved the strange device back to her pocket, its glow fading like an ember at the end of a long vigil. Henry's face lingered in my mind, steady, commanding, and impossibly close, until even memory began to blur at its edges. I turned my eyes once more to the window. The sky was deepening now, layered in greys and faint rose, the clouds suspended like slow-drifting thoughts. Somewhere beyond them, your world continued. Its flying carriages, its glass that remembers faces, its voices carried by invisible winds. I tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring, but even imagination has its limits. My hands lay quietly upon the blanket, pale against the white. I traced the faint tremor in them, not fear, not entirely, but something gentler, the exhaustion of wonder. So much seen, so much unknown. At length, I drew a slow breath and let it settle deep in my chest. I think, I said softly, almost to myself, this has been quite enough for one day. My voice trembled with a weary fondness. Your world is too full of miracles for an old soul just finding his feet again. I looked up at the nurse, her kind eyes, her calm presence in this age that feels both holy and strange, and offered a faint smile. I must rest now, I murmured. But if ever you would like to hear more, about the streets I knew, the voices I heard, the lives that filled my England, do let me know. There are stories still waiting in the corners of my memory, and perhaps... I paused, my eyes drifting once more to the faint reflection in the window, the outline of a man both ancient and new. Perhaps they would like to be remembered too. The hum of the room deepened, the light dimmed, and I closed my eyes. The sound of time, it seemed, was quieter than I ever imagined.